So I'm going to run through the initial part just to set the context, try and explain what I'm trying to do with this research. It's not a fully developed paper, but I'm close to completing it, and your feedback and comments would be most useful. So the broader context for this work is to look at the problem of orderly urban expansion. Okay, so what is the problem? That all growing cities, they require three types of growth in a spatial sense, right? So you need one, vertical expansion. You need to go higher as the city adds population and the city grows. You need to grow horizontally as the city grows, and then you need infill, which is the empty spaces the city creates as it grows, right? So today I'm looking at something very specific, which is horizontal expansion, the outward expansion of cities in India. And this has been raised or flagged as an issue by many people over a long period of time. Growth or horizontal expansion in India is a huge problem. It's disorderly, it's unplanned, it creates a problem of sprawl, which then inhibits the government's ability to supply basic infrastructure, water, even other more softer public goods like security, policing, ambulances, and so on, right? So while you should allow growth to take place as dynamically as possible, allowing the markets to function, you do have the problem of being able to provide infrastructure while that city is expanding in a planned way, right? So there are two challenges. One is, how do you acquire land as the city grows, and how do you plan that acquired land properly? Okay, so that's the problem I'm trying to address through this work. What has been the experience in India? That's been largely characterized by sprawl, inadequate infrastructure in terms of road, water, and sanitation. Even areas that are coming up newly will often have a lack of adequate road infrastructure, water supply, and so on. And we are beginning to see a disturbing phenomenon, which is productivity in urban areas. I mean, the rate of growth of productivity is plateauing, and the rate of productivity growth in rural areas is actually catching up. So this is something that Professor O.P. Mathur is writing about. We have a low affordability issue, which means housing is not affordable, and we have relatively low rates of urbanization. So the typical discourse in India is that a large volume of people are migrating and we are seeing huge amounts of urbanization. But if you look at global rates of urbanization, if you look at the pace at which UK, US, most Western economies, even say China, South Korea urbanized, our rate of urbanization is actually relatively low. It's not a very high rate. So just to give you a frame of reference, the city of Beijing grew by about 8 times in 35 years. Delhi has grown about 50% in 20 years. Okay, so just to give you a frame of reference, comparing two large capital cities and two growing countries.
Does that assume that the boundaries of the city is the same?
No, so one part of this is that the municipal boundaries are also expanding as the city grows, so that you can then plan it and govern it as a municipality. Okay, so what has happened in the last 15-20 years? The typical Indian traditional model was to acquire large pieces of land and then to plan them. So you use the Land Acquisition Act, or there were land acquisition provisions under your town planning laws, your urban development laws. You used eminent domain and acquired the land, and you then planned it. And obviously, land acquisition was not, it's not been done very fairly in India. We've all seen the horrors of land acquisition, including in capital cities.
Old land acquisition was for anything the state felt like.
Yes, so
it could be to expand a city, it could be to build a highway,
yes.
It could be to buy land for a private guy to build a factory.
Yes.
It was pretty much unchanged.
So there was a very broad definition of what constituted public purpose.
Eminent domain.
Yes, and eminent domain could be used for anything that was a public purpose. So you could say that setting up an industry in this area serves a public purpose because it would create jobs, right? And then you acquire land for industry. Sometimes you would even have cases where you acquire the land under one public purpose and then you change the purpose. You say you're going to set up a factory and then you, build a school or something like that, right? So it was very broadly construed, and all this kind of manipulation was upheld by the courts saying once you've acquired the land, it belongs to the government, you can do whatever you want with it, right? Doesn't matter. So the experience with acquisition wasn't great either for the people whose land was getting acquired, and I mean, as a lot of data shows, development authorities did not really develop the land as per their own projections, which are often short of what actually happened. So I'll just give you some sense of the numbers. So what happened in the 90s was obviously land prices started increasing because the demand for land escalated. That made acquisition much more expensive. And then you had a double whammy in 2013 where the land acquisition law was overhauled. There was a new land acquisition law which mandated much higher compensation. So first it said you have to pay compensation at market value. You can't use any other value. And it gives a very detailed framework for how you have to calculate market value to try and avoid any manipulation or discretion in how you actually go around computing this. And it increased the procedural requirements. So you have to do a social impact audit, you have to do rehabilitation and resettlement for people you can't compensate easily. And this made acquisition much more difficult, in addition to the fact that land prices were increasing during this period. Right? So now what has happened as a consequence is people are looking at other alternatives to land acquisition models and trying to use them for urban expansion. Some of them were already existing in a lot of legislation in India, but were never used. So Maharashtra, for example, had a town planning scheme which was first used in 1915, and then around the 1950s and 60s, for whatever reason, the state stopped using it, and now it's gone back to it.
So I'm just curious, why do the hard work of a town planning scheme when you can just grab the land?
Exactly.
So once property rights are destroyed,
Yeah.
and a government can just grab land,
Right.
then the town planning scheme is too much work.
Exactly. So, I mean, all the public choice incentives are against doing a town planning scheme because, and I'll come to it again, the process through which you do a scheme is hard. It's not just acquiring land, issuing an order saying you're going to get this compensation and then sit on it. You actually have to work a lot with the local landowners. Right. Okay. So, one model is a town planning scheme. The other is a model that is being tried afresh or more recently in India, which are commonly known as land assembly or pooling schemes. Amravati was a good example, and it was quite a successful example, at least for the land acquisition part of it. They were able to pool the land. Then, I mean, the capital didn't work out for political reasons, but the land pooling part of it worked out very well. They were able to acquire about 95 to 96% of the land they needed within the target framework, the timeline. One key starting point or key argument that I want to present here relates to the fact that in 2018 the union government started pushing the town planning scheme, and it launched a pilot saying all smart cities in India should ideally do a pilot of a smart city, of a town planning scheme within their jurisdiction. What I'm going to argue is that we should not be pushing one model right now. This is a period of experimentation. A lot of different cities and states are going to come up with their own model. We should be considering what actually the intrinsic advantages and disadvantages of different models are, and then take a call. Okay, so what am I trying to do here? I'm trying to explain different models for acquiring land. So I'll go through the TPS and contrast it with Delhi's land pooling scheme in some detail. I'll explain how land is being acquired for development in Delhi, because I'm assuming that the TPS is something that has been done for a while and the pooling scheme is something that's relatively new. So I'll try to compare and contrast both of them. And I'll explain why you need to contextualize or think about these systems that are more local and endogenous to the larger, market dynamics within that region. And I'm going to try and highlight that actually state capability is a critical variable in how you think about which model you want to pick. Okay. So I'm going to start with a very brief background on how land acquisition and development is done. So we have a distinction between a development authority and a municipal authority. So in Delhi, for example, a MCD is a municipal body, and a Delhi Development Authority is a development body. Okay, so the DDA is supposed to acquire land, plan it, build the amenities, and then hand it over to the municipal body, which is going to actually govern that region. Okay. So most of the things we are going to talk about today pertain to the DDA and the AUDA and the PMRDA and so on, and not the MCD and the BMC and so on and so forth. Okay, so I was talking about the fact that land acquisition didn't actually work very well. So this is some basic facts and figures from how land acquisition in Delhi has gone. So the first major land acquisition in Delhi was in 1961 when the first master plan was written down, and they projected that they would need about 57,000 acres. In 1978, they found out that they were able to acquire only 13,400 acres. Okay. Similarly, there was a huge shortfall in the next plan. So the next plan, again, they projected about 20,000 acres, and they were able to acquire about 11,000. Okay. And even this 57,000 and 20,000 was based on a population projection that was an underestimate. Okay. So you are actually under projecting or underestimating what you're going to need, and then you're building about a third to a half of what you are projecting. Okay. So it's a huge, this is basically a huge case to be made against the whole idea of land acquisition-led development that took place. Okay. So what were the consequences? One, you were not able to provide the housing that you wanted to do. Two, you acquired land and you sat on it and you didn't develop it. Right? So that actually inflated land prices in the rest of the city because you created an artificial scarcity. Right? So over 40 years, basically people came to realize that this is not working, and then DDA ran out of money to actually do this kind of acquisition-led development over a period of time. Yeah. So how is pooling different? Pooling is, A, there is no eminent domain being used here, and B, it treats your landowner as more of a participant and a stakeholder rather than someone who has to be expropriated. Okay, so people divide different models of pooling in different ways. I am dividing it along two ways. One is the degree of state coercion or voluntariness that is inherent in different ways, in different schemes, and whether the actual implementation is led primarily by the state or it's private sector led or led by private developers or consortiums. Yeah.
Who pays for acquisition?
Who picks?
Who pays?
Who pays? There is no acquisition here.
In case DDA want to acquire 30,000 acres of land, where the money comes from?
The state government. So the DDA actually, technically DDA does not acquire the land. The DDA will be capitalized by the central government. It's a central government agency. They will ask the state government that we need this land. The state government will go out and acquire that land, and before handing over, DDA will pay the state government. So DDA pays the Delhi government for the acquisition and then gets the land.
And we're doing some work in Karnataka. There's a lot of UBAs, Urban Development Authority.
The same thing, yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
So every urban local body will have one of these things, and they will have to.
Yes, yeah. So many municipalities or smaller towns might not have a development body, and some cities, even within the same state, will give the same power to the municipal body. So I was in Pimpri-Chinchwad Municipal Corporation, where there is no urban development body. The PCMC is both the development authority and the municipality, which is a far cleaner version of doing things because you are the municipality, you are governing the area. Right? But for historical reasons, we've had this entity called a DDA and a development authority and so on. So many large cities, at least, you will see a body called a development authority. Okay. So there is a distinction between different schemes depending on the degree of voluntariness that is involved. So a town planning scheme, for example, it's not a consensual scheme. It is something where a lot of consultations happen, but it is not something you have an option to step out of. Okay. So your views will be taken, but you're still forced to stay in the scheme. Okay. The land assembly and aggregation schemes are voluntary, so you are incentivized to participate. There are incentives given, and sometimes there is soft coercion. So in news reports you will read that for all the land pooling in Amravati, at least for some villages, there was a soft threat: if you don't participate, we'll acquire your land. Okay, so there is always some soft coercion to convince the holdout to participate in these schemes. And Amravati was also, there was an imperative for actually developing a capital, so you could probably understand why that kind of coercion was exercised. Right, so so that's about the degree of voluntariness, and then there is the question of state involvement. So you again have two broad models. One is something where the state is more interventionist and the state leads the land pooling or the land assembly scheme. And Amravati is a good example, but most town planning schemes are more state-led schemes, and I'll explain why. And then there are private-led schemes, which are, Delhi is an example, and Haryana is also a very good example where private-led schemes are have been used for the last 30-40 years. Okay. So what is common to both of these? Right? So what does a pooling scheme look like? Usually the state will take over around a third to 40% of your land. It will use this to develop amenities, widen roads, lay down sanitation, drainage, so on, and build, take away space for hospitals or dispensaries and whatever it is, and return 60 to 70% of the plot to you. The residents benefit because obviously you move from an area that is completely greenfield, usually agricultural and on the periphery of the city, to an area which has modern amenities, so land values and property prices will escalate. Right. Residents are usually asked to pay development charges. So to the question of financing, how does a scheme like this get financed? It is the residents or the landowners who are paying for everything, basically. Right. So both Delhi and Ahmedabad, they will charge you some kind of a external development charges, which is basically computed on a per hectare basis. And this is the money that the development authority will use to build the infrastructure on the 30-40% of the land that they've taken. In addition to that, sometimes some states will reserve, say, 5 to 10% of the total area for themselves. So they'll just take it over and then they'll monetize it later. So that's another financing mechanism. Yeah. So the advantage is the state is not putting in any money. There is no large investment being made by the DDA or the AUDA in this scheme. Yeah. And the added advantage is you avoid acquisition-related litigation. So DDA, if you look at it, has a huge litigation wing right now that it maintains. Yeah. So the next question is, why did Delhi choose land pooling and not TPS? TPS is much older. It's been running for a long time. Right? So I'll just give you a very brief run on what the TPS is. So it's been in India, it's been practiced in Maharashtra and Gujarat since the early 1900s. The Ahmedabad Urban Development Authority has implemented more than 247 town planning schemes within the AUDA area, redeveloped or developed around 400 square kilometers. It's now being implemented in many other cities. Like I said, Maharashtra has restarted doing TPS. Pune is a good example where TPS schemes are in operation right now. Yeah. So how does it work? Basically, the development authority submits a plan, the state government approves it, and very importantly, they appoint someone called a town planning officer, who is not appointed by the development authority. It's appointed by the state government or the governor. Okay? This is to make sure that the person is independent of the entire machinery of the development agency. This person then makes a town planning scheme in consultation with the landowner. So they'll hold hearings of all the landowners. They'll present a scheme, get objections, revise it, then submit it to the state government for approval. The other important thing they do, and this is why he has to be independent, is he does all the land assembly. So all the land title records, who will get which redeveloped plot, right? Because sometimes if there is a plan made, you will not get the exact same plot that you were occupying earlier, right? So those are the things that are interested to this person. And then once this is all done, they take possession of the property along the roads. They leave the rest of it to develop as and when people want to sell their property. And the owner is handed over a possession receipt of the new plot. Right? So at some point you get your new plot. And then you submit the final scheme to the state government and the revenue records are updated. So this is the broad mechanism through which a TPS works. And this is a slow process. It takes about 10, 15, 20 years depending on the size of the area and so on. Right? Okay. In contrast, what is Delhi's land pooling scheme? This was notified in 2013, so it's been in operation for about 11 years now. The imperative for this was in the master plan 2041. They said we need 17 lakh houses for Delhi to accommodate an additional 80 lakh people who are going to be in Delhi by 2041. Okay. So the scheme is notified across a huge area. It's about 19,000 hectares of land. It's much larger than almost any other land pooling scheme in the country. And the master plan, number of documents say that the acquisition-led model wasn't working. We had to do something else. And what do? They take 60% of the land for residential, leave 40%, they take 40% and leave 60% with the landowners. The difference is that here the applicants themselves have to form a consortium. Okay, so a consortium could be a private developer who just creates a corporate entity which is a consortium after having aggregated land from all the landowners. Right? So it could be a DLF or an Ansal or a Godrej who comes and creates a consortium, and they do all the planning and the land assembly for the sector. Okay? It's not the town planning official who's doing this. And the criteria is that as soon as you get 70% area within a sector as contiguous, you can come to the DDA to get an application for land pooling, and they have to pay EDC to the DDA. Okay. So just for some frame of reference, this is Delhi's master plan. These are all the vacant areas where the land pooling scheme is being operated. So everything in yellow. This is basically about 100 villages right now. Their land use has been changed from agriculture to urban. So now they are eligible to be classified or developed as urban spaces. So this is basically a lot of the northwest and western parts of Delhi. Okay.
What's the green?
The green is the green belt. It's excluded from the land pooling area. Okay. So how do they break it all down? It's about 130 sectors. So this yellow has been broken down into 130 chunks, about 100 to 200 hectares each. So far, the DDA is claiming that about a third of the landowners have expressed some interest to pool their land. This is obviously not contiguous, so it's not 36% of sectors. It's 36% of people in that area. Right? As of February 22, about 19,000 parcels have been submitted. But again, they are not contiguous, and all the data is available on the DDA website. So they keep putting up sector-wise notifications as and when people come and say that they want to pool. But this is basically the amount of development that's taken place, and about 4 to 5 sectors have now applied for or have reached the final stage of consortium development and pooling. So if you look at it, it's about 4 to 5 out of 129, which is not a large number. So I went and talked to people in the DDA to ask them how they view the progress of this scheme. And what they are saying is that we have approved, at least at the initial stage, about 30% of the total project area for pooling. Okay. And their view is that at some point there will be an inflection point once there is a sufficient number of or amount of development starting to take place. Other people will see the value proposition, land values will escalate more, and then you will have much faster take up. Okay. And their claim is that they are not going out there to persuade people to do this. If people see value, they'll come and do this themselves. Okay. One problem they flagged was that there was a problem regarding what kind of contractual arrangements the landowner will enter into with the developer, right? So then they came out with a model contract, and apparently now it's been solved. So this is also a shift in the DDA's approach. It used to be a developer, a housing, basically a builder, right? And now it's become more of a facilitator. So we'll also need to see to what degree it can actually do this, because now it's actually doing grievance redress, it's drafting model contracts, it's supervising whether the developer is following the plan. Earlier it was doing all of that itself, right? So it's a transition from a builder to a regulator or a quasi-regulator. Okay, so why did they choose land pooling? One big thing was that the state of Haryana has had a huge success in doing private land assembly for development. Right? So all of Gurgaon, if you look at it, is basically private-led development. In the 1970s, their urban development law basically allowed for private land assembly. It said that we will notify an area as an area that can be developed, and then private developers can go in there and aggregate land and submit the plan for redevelopment or for classification as urban and then development. And in the last 30-40 years, Haryana has seen a lot of urbanization and growth, and this was something that the DDA took up. The other reason that I've heard anecdotally from people was that when the scheme was being drafted, there was a huge emphasis on the fact that the DDA should have minimal touch points with people who are coming for applications and permissions, because you don't want, or you want minimal discretion at the hands of the DDA when it's giving sanctions and approvals. Okay? So you wanted the DDA to be as less involved in the entire process as possible. Okay? And that was one reason why they consciously picked a model where they did not go in for a town planning scheme kind of framework. Okay? And again, this is something very specific to Delhi, and I'm bringing it up because it's obviously not something that is uniformly applicable. Clearly the AUDA works in a different way, there's a greater degree of credibility and so on. Right? And the last thing is, there was some internal capability question within the DDA itself. The 2010s were a period when there were a lot of retirements, so urban planners and all were retiring at a quick rate, and there was not adequate recruitment at that point of time. So that was the third reason they gave. Okay, so I've taken you through two models. So I'll just try to argue why I don't think one is inherently better than the other in any normative sense. So, I mean, the design of the scheme matters because obviously how you do the land assembly, how you do the planning will affect the eventual outcome, right? So, and in both cases you will see that the DDA also makes detailed plans, and the AUDA and the TPS also requires the development body to make detailed plans, and the TPS requires detailed consultative processes, whereas the land pooling scheme does not really require consultative processes because it happens through private negotiations between the developer and the landowners. Right. So I've tried to create a framework where you can actually compare the differences in the design and see whether there's something inherently normatively superior between one framework or the other. Okay, so when you look at what costs are incurred during this process, right, so there are planning costs, there are land assembly costs, and then there are infrastructure provisioning costs. Okay, so the planning cost is what do you need to do to actually make the plan? You need to do some survey, reconcile land use and so on. Then you have the cost of aggregating, looking at titles, resolving any disputes, figuring out who will get what plot and so on. And the third is about providing the actual amenities that you are doing the entire exercise for, right? And then there are benefits that will accrue to different stakeholders in slightly different ways. So for the government, it's the lower cost of finance, it's easier cost recovery. For the developers, obviously it's return on investment. For the landowners, it's the profit that you incur from the land assembly. And in cases where they're both the same, you're looking at both, right? And for the eventual consumer of housing or the amenity, it's increased access to real estate. So if you look at them one by one, what I'm trying to show is that in many cases, there's no inherent benefit or cost that you see from examining each of these along these parameters. So if you look at the town planning scheme, you do need to do micro level planning for each sector. The AUDA does local area planning and micro planning. In the DDS case, the micro planning is required for the 40% that it takes. The 60% is done by the private developer. When you're looking at land assembly costs, this is the major difference, because under TPS it's done by the state, whereas under Delhi's model it's basically being done by a private developer. So the cost is still there, it's just being apportioned differently, right? So the choices that you make are basically based upon whether you have a viable or a credible real estate market, what kind of capabilities does the state have, what is the efficiency of the redress mechanism, the oversight mechanism that you can develop. The third kind of cost is obviously the infrastructure cost, and here again, I mean, basically you have to do the same activity. It is the same kind of cost, and therefore there is no intrinsic difference between the schemes. The same thing happens when you're looking at the cost of financing. You're basically charging the landowner or the developer a development charge and using that to build the amenity. Delivery times, some people have made a distinction saying land pooling, the TPS takes a long time, land pooling might take a shorter period of time, but actually it's contingent on many different things. So it might be dependent on the initial starting point or the amount of resources available with the development authority, the time it takes to create a plan, to get it approved, all of which are kind of exogenous to the plan, to the implementation itself, right? Then you look at returns on investment for developers. Again, there is nothing intrinsically different between doing this through a TPS or doing this through land pooling. And again, when you look at how is the profit from a land assembly shared, again, the town planning scheme gives a lot of potential for state, for the developers, for landowners to profit concurrently. This can happen within land pooling as well. One point people make is that when you do land pooling, a lot of the profit can potentially go to the aggregator or to the developer. However, there's nothing, I mean, inherently wrong in this, right? So it's he or she is undertaking the cost of assembly and aggregation, and they're entitled to that additional cost for doing that work, right? Okay. Last two or three. So then there is the question of, we are going to take over your property for redevelopment. How long can you not use it for, right? And what will you do in the meantime? Again, nothing intrinsic to any of the schemes. It's about how fast can you deliver the redeveloped plot, right? That does not depend on whether you do TPS or you do land pooling. It's about what is the pace of infrastructure delivery and redevelopment. And you can actually get around it. Haryana provides compensation for people whose land is being taken over, and even in a purely private system. So they'll say, if you surrender your land, we'll give you rent or 1 lakh per year or something like that to cover for the cost of rent. And then we guarantee that we'll hand over the redeveloped plot within X amount of time. Okay. And they go as far as to say we'll impose, or the implementing body will pay penalties if we can't pay you or give you the redeveloped plot within that period of time. Increased access to affordable real estate. Again, there are so many parts that are completely exogenous to which kind of scheme you are picking. So it depends on the quality of planning, depends on the infrastructure and the market features. So it's not something that's dependent on the scheme's design. And the last point I argue is basically the critical variable, which is what is the degree of state capability that A, you have, and B, you're willing to build to implement a particular scheme. And why I'm saying this is, it's possible that the same municipality or the same development authority might use a TPS for one project and a land pooling alternative for another project, depending on what is the best way of implementing urban planning is in that area, right? So for example, a lot of people make arguments that if you have completely greenfield land, it's easier to do TPS, but if it's slightly developed, then you should do something more akin to private assembly and aggregation, because you can't plan it from scratch, right? So there is the state capability component is, in my opinion, the critical variable here. And that's why I'm making the argument that the choice of how you implement an urban expansion scheme is basically endogenous to your local market, to your local context, and there should not be one scheme and one model that you are proposing throughout the country. Just as an example, if you were to design a town planning scheme in Delhi, the DDA Act does not even have provisions for doing TPS. Okay? So you would, and they have not done anything like a TPS for 60 years. So you would need to amend the law, you would need to train or hire resources within DDA and build the capability to do a TPS. Whereas it might be far easier to do something like a private land assembly within the DDA, given that Haryana is adjacent, they've seen that experience, then the landowners in Delhi have seen the experience of Haryana, and that might be a far more credible mechanism. Right? So to conclude, I'll basically end with this point that it's hard to make the argument that there is one mechanism that's better than the other, and that you should, if the union government is thinking of pushing these models, it should actually be focusing on what the principles of doing consensual or voluntary land assembly are, rather than to say you should adopt one model or the other. And I'll end there and I'll take questions. Thank you.